So what I want to talk about today is very much the work that Chris has just referred to, helping EdTech companies, particularly small and medium-sized ones, to be able to demonstrate the impact of what they're doing, because that's really important. And everything that we do at Educate Ventures is informed by research. And yes, my heart is as an academic, but I'm a very pragmatic academic. So what I'm really interested in is making a difference in the world. And therefore, it's really important that what we do is practically useful. Yes, it's research informed, but it's practically useful. And that's very much what I want to communicate to you today. This is about being practically useful. And at the end, I'll say something about artificial intelligence as well. But I'm focusing today on how we help companies demonstrate the efficacy of what it is they're doing. And by the way, is Sandeep here? Yes, you are. I've just got to highlight something you said, which I know to be true. And it's very obvious, but thank you for saying it. People don't invest in teacher training. It's not an investment subject, is it? And yet, unless a teacher changes their behavior, education will not change. And changing a teacher's behavior is driven by teacher training. It's a really interesting fact that you so eloquently highlighted. Very interesting. And so really when we've got companies developing technologies, applying technology in education, it's all about behavior change. That's what they're trying to achieve, a change in behavior. And we want to help them show that they are bringing about that change in behavior, which obviously we want to be a positive change. So let's get started. Of course, you all know the answer to this. You know what educational technology is. But I'm an academic, so you have to allow me a definition because, hey, you know, academics, we love our definitions. But this is really important because it's about facilitating learning and improving performance. Does that seem fair? Is that a fair description of what we're trying to do? We're also trying to change education, obviously. But I think at heart, it's about facilitating learning and improving performance. And that might be through improving teaching, but it's still about facilitating learning and improving performance. But how do we know if an educational technology product or service is facilitating learning and improving performance? Because that's what really matters, isn't it? So back in, well, before 2016, it just happened that the paper was published in 2016, I had been working for a number of years in artificial intelligence and education. Now, I've been doing this work for about 30 years. And for many of those years, I wasn't even allowed to say AI, because AI was a dirty word. And so I adopted educational technology as a way of talking not just about educational technology, but also about AI. And I'd been working in educational technology AI for a number of years. And back in 2011 it was, I was really struck by how we didn't really have a very good way of answering the question, how do we know if it works or not? And so I would hear politician after politician in the UK and in other parts of the world say, yeah, we'll invest if you can show us it works. But what does that mean? Show us it works. And so I thought about it, and I got together a group of people at the Knowledge Lab where I work at University College London, and there were people who came from large tech companies like Microsoft, small tech companies, from the education sector, from the research sector, and I brought in a facilitator, a very skilled facilitator, somebody called Jonathan Drury, who is a BBC producer actually, but also a passionate educator. And we talked about the disconnect between the people who use the technology, the people who build the technology, and people who understand how you can show whether it works or not. In other words, the researchers, the developers, and the practitioners. And I'd include learners in that practitioner space as well, the people who are using the technology. And we had this meeting, we had this conversation, and there was lots of evidence that any connection that existed between a researcher and a developer, or a researcher and a practitioner, was mainly driven by chance. You happen to have met somebody at a conference and you can make a connection, and therefore you've developed some kind of collaboration and it can be impactful. But really there was no systemic way to connect these communities. And so this is where this idea of the golden triangle, and the golden triangle sits behind everything we do at Educate Ventures research, came about. It was about the 3 points represent those 3 communities. And the gold is the data and evidence. So how can we connect these 3 communities around understanding the data and evidence with the imperative of being able to show that we're facilitating learning and improving performance? So that's where this came from. And I honestly believe that it's ecosystems, and again, the panel talked about ecosystems. It's this ecosystem that really matters, and it's this ecosystem that we have to support and build. I also believe, and I'll come to that at the end, that AI is a real tool to help us do this. So, what do we need evidence for? This is often what we're asked by small companies who come on our training programs, and here are just some of the reasons why you might want some evidence. You want to show, of course, that your product or service is effective. It might be to help you decide what services or products you're going to commission in the future. Increasing accountability for stakeholders, extremely important. Creating effective campaigns and communication. If you can say, look, we have evidence that our technology is having the impact that we desire, that's good for communications, and it's good for helping you with your marketing as well. Developing funding bids, aligning services with customer needs, and developing your workforce. And again, I come back to that point that Sandeep started us off. I chose to start my talk very much reflecting on that. Capacity building within the education space, within the education profession of practitioners is super important. So that last piece, that last point there, developing a workforce, it's also important to develop the workforce of the EdTech company so that they become research-minded as we move forward. Now, of course, as an academic, I can point you to lots of papers, and this is just a little selection of papers that talk about the efficacy of EdTech, and we've got examples from maths and science, and also that last one, EdTech can be a source of stress among teachers due to lack of training and support. So there's this kind of traditional research base, which is important, but that's really not accessible to a small company, a medium-sized company. They don't have the resources to conduct a randomized control trial right off the get-go. They don't have the resources to do the research. So how do we help them do something meaningful and develop that research and evidence mindset, which means they're constantly looking to think, how can I show I'm facilitating learning and improving performance? And that's where this started. And we've now worked with, actually, it's more than 275 small companies mainly, but some you might recognise over the years, and we've taken them through this programme. And the programme's evolved, but it's still absolutely the same at its heart, and it's that heart that I'm going to talk about. So this was the original map for the programme. We had a programme to help companies become evidence-aware. What is evidence, basically? What does it mean to me? Because often when you talk to a small company about research, they think about market research. And so we need to move on from that. Of course, market research is extremely important, but we need to think about research in other ways and evidence in other ways. And everything we do is based on the theory of change and logic model, which I'll talk a bit about in a minute. And then we want to move them from becoming aware to actually applying that research mindset, that seeking of evidence in what they're doing. And as I say, building capacity in their workforce to understand what that means. And so theory of change is at the heart of what we do. And the theory of change is exactly about trying to bring about a change in human behaviour. It might be to improve secondary school students' English essay writing. It might be to improve the engagement of students who have a particular learning difficulty. It might be many other things, but it's always about people. It's always about wanting to bring about a change that's driven by a change in human behaviour. You have to get ready for that change. You often have to unfreeze. What I'm hearing constantly, and I've had the delight of being in Singapore, Taiwan, Australia in the last few weeks, as well as here in Hong Kong. And I'm hearing some very similar things in many places, that at the moment, we're in a very particular space where there's a lot of unfreezing that needs to happen in the education sector, because there's still a lot of rooting in traditional ways of doing things, which now we have AI, probably is not a good way to be going. And so you can see that as a great example of a need for unfreezing. So if we're going to make a change, we have to kind of unfreeze from where we are. Then we need the process of transition, and that's where the logic model comes in to help us get from start to finish. And then we need to adapt to the new normal. So here's the basis of what we do, basically, as we help companies get from there to there. This is what they all want to do. They want to have an impact, and it is that impact on a human behaviour. So how do we help them evidence their journey so that they can build better products, they can have more meaningful conversations with teachers, learners, whoever it is their customers are, and they can continue to grow capacity in their workforce to be research-minded. And so we start with our resources, and you'll see at every step along the way, there's this big thing that says assumptions. I think one of the biggest challenges is to get people to recognise their assumptions. Time after time after time, I have sat with a new entrepreneur who's telling me about, very excitedly usually, which is great, about what it is they're doing. And very rarely are they fully aware of the huge assumptions they are making about, for example, the nature of the classroom context that their product is going to be used in, the extent to which the teaching workforce is ready for their product or service. There are huge assumptions being made at every step of the way. So we start with the resources. What is it you're going to provide for your users? And we take them through the activities. What's the activity you want to support through your product or service? What do you want the output? And that's different from the outcome. What do you want the output? Is it an essay or successful completion of a maths paper or a more engaged learner? What is it? What is it that you're wanting to achieve as an output? And then what do you want that outcome to be? What does success look like? And then, of course, it's that impact. How can we show that behaviour has changed? And it has changed through what you have done. You have had an impact. So that's what it's all about. And we help people understand the types of evidence, because often people, in fact, I say often, almost always, when we speak to new entrepreneurs, they have their hearts set on proving. It's always, I want to prove that my application is better than X or makes a significant difference to Y. And you have to kind of step back and say, okay, so that's the causal evidence, this orange box here, that's the hardest one. We very rarely actually get causal evidence. It's very hard to demonstrate, though again, I think rich data and AI has a big role to play in this. It can really move us forward in that respect, to show that a particular thing that you have done, a particular intervention that you have made, is the thing that's made the difference. Because there's this thing called context that invariably makes a huge difference to what happens. So we take them through the journey from anecdotal evidence to causal evidence, through descriptive evidence and correlational evidence. And often what we end up with is correlational evidence, and that's true even when we use intelligent analytics. You can show a relationship between, okay, we've had a group of students and they've been using this product or service for a number of weeks or months or whatever, and we can see some interaction patterns, we can see what they've been doing with the software or hardware, whatever it is. And we can also see that they've improved their engagement, they've learnt more, they've had more conversations with peers, they're obviously engaging with the subject material, et cetera, but it's often still correlational. You can see there's a relationship, but you can't necessarily say that this particular function of your software or this particular action the student take is the reason that they've improved. So it's really important to help companies understand the difference between correlation and causal evidence. And so we set them up to build their logic model. And these are the kind of questions we ask them to run through in order to create this logic model. So who are your users, right through to what are the outcomes of the activities over time, trying to get them really pin down what it is they're trying to achieve. And then we take them through step by step. And I'm not going to go through every step because there isn't time, and you're an intelligent audience. You will get it from the two examples I will give you. But if we start with that first step, resources. So this is an example from a product that's about helping students write essays, secondary school age students. So that's sort of 11 to 16 or 18 years, depending on exactly what kind of school you're talking about. And so here we start with the resources. What is it you're going to give them? And key thing, what are the assumptions you are making? Are you assuming that there is a stable internet connection, for example? How do you know that's true? Are you assuming that the teacher is trained appropriately? You know, there's a huge amount of work done now on what's called implementation research, because it's not just about designing a really good product or service. It's how it's used and how it's implemented within an environment can make a huge amount of difference. So what are your assumptions about how that's going to be done? And here you go. All students and teachers have stable access to an appropriate device. That's an assumption. You need to get that out there. You need to explicitly state the assumptions so that you can test the assumptions. Because unless you test them, you don't know if actually the initial context that you're introducing your product or service into is one where it has a chance of working effectively and facilitating learning and increasing performance. And then if we go right to the other end, it's the same thing. We're asking the questions. What's the vision behind your product or service? Again, what are the assumptions you are making? And have you tested these assumptions? And really, rarely is the answer yes. And so companies benefit enormously from being taken through this process. And we just literally take them through the process. We help them build the logic model, and we help them understand their assumptions, the questions they need to ask, and the way that they can build out a process within their company where they can constantly be looking to capture data at every step in that logic model journey. And we take them through types of data. So here's just some example, the kind of data you can get from the back end of a piece of software. What are you going to do with that? User feedback. What might you learn from that? Performance data, which is often the data that people are most familiar with when they come to us. Yes, I want to increase math scores by X more than somebody else's product or service, or not having the product or service at all. There's lots of different sorts of data, and we try to open companies' minds to thinking about those different sorts of data. And we think about qualitative data as well as quantitative data, because both are extremely important. And often it's the qualitative data that will tell you why. If the quantitative data is telling you, yes, I've made a difference, but you need the qualitative data to really know why. What is it about your product or service that might be helping to make that difference? So we also look at qualitative data. And we help them chart the way that the data maps to the logic model that we're helping them to build. So we can look at a type of data and think about, okay, so that, if we talk about clickstream data, login data, the kind of thing we get from platforms all the time, what kind of measures might that enable us to do? What might that indicate? Well, we might use it for looking at engagement, for example. Engagement is very complex. I think somebody's already talked about complex human behaviours. That's a very complex human behaviour, and I hear often people say, it's increased engagement. And I say, yeah, okay, what do you mean it's increased engagement? They've used it more. Is that really engagement? I'm not sure. I think I want a bit of a richer definition of engagement. I want to know they've actually engaged with the learning, not just using the software. So we try and get beyond the very obvious statements about, yes, they've used my product a lot. And what's the real objective of that data, that indicator, that measure, all linked back to that logic model? And then we help them to build a research proposal. A research proposal that's not going to end up in a publication in a journal, though it could do if they wanted it to, but that's not the aim. This is a very practical research proposal about what they're going to do in their company and how they're going to engage the people in their company in the enterprise of practically pulling forward this research proposal. So we look at the context, we look at the research questions. In all of the time that I've been in academia, which is a lot of years, I have had the pleasure of helping many wonderful PhD students complete their PhD and many wonderful master students complete their dissertations. And the hardest thing every time, without exception, is identifying the best research questions. Now, I'm sure we could have a really interesting discussion for the rest of the day about how our education systems don't build people who are capable of asking really good questions. And you see it enormously when it comes to research proposals. You need really good research questions because that will drive the methodology that you use, the data you collect, the way that you answer the questions. And so we do focus a lot on what's that research questions, what really matters, and that comes out of that logic model. Of course, we think about ethics, super important, increasingly so when we're talking about data and AI. And then, very practical, how are you going to do this? What's your schedule? Where's your manpower? Can you do this? Or person power, I should say. Have you got the resources to do this? Who's going to do it? When are they going to do it? And very practical, let's get the nitty-gritty done. And we help them do that. And so where does the logic model fit into this? Well, you've got your state before the intervention. If you think about your piece of research as being an intervention, it's a study, it's an intervention to look and see you are introducing your product or service and you are hoping it's going to make a difference to human behavior. You are intervening. You are wanting to bring about change. So we need to think about the outputs, the outcomes, and then we also need to think about the potential for bias in the way that you might be trying to measure. So not only are assumptions important, it's also important to understand that you might be guilty of being biased in the group of participants that you've selected to be part of your study. Perhaps they're particularly able. You need to be careful about making sure that when you're asking people to give consent to be part of your study, that you're not kind of bribing them in some way to be part of the study, because that might also have an impact on the results that you get. So we need to be valid and reliable in what we're doing here. And we need to recognize these other intervening factors. I said context earlier, and this is another way of expressing that. Many, many years ago, there was a piece of work done in the United Kingdom on something called integrated learning systems. Only somebody who's my age would remember, but Kareem's smiling at me, and you were probably a head teacher at the time when integrated learning systems were the best thing since sliced bread. They were going to change education for good. And they were very basic adaptive systems. And we conducted a study in the UK across multiple schools, all of whom had the same interactive integrated learning system, used with the same age students, similar demographics. Guess what? No significant differences. But huge differences between schools. So it was not possible to say this product significantly improves learning, but it was possible to say, over here, when it was implemented in this way, in this context, it had a positive impact. Oh, but over here, it didn't. Because context makes a huge difference, and that's what these other intervening factors are drawing attention to. And it goes back to what I was saying about how difficult it is to get causal evidence. But all of this comes back to this. How can we help EdTechs know if their product is facilitating learning and improving performance? And having worked with the number of companies that we've worked with now, I can say that building a logic model on the basis of a sound theory of change does really help them to demonstrate for themselves and for other people that their product or service is facilitating learning and improving performance. Now, I said right at the start that I would say something at the end about AI, because I don't feel I can come here and not say something about AI, because it's supremely important. When we think about AI, in many ways in education at the moment, I find it useful to think about it through three lenses. The first one, how can we use it to support teaching and learning? How can it be part of an EdTech product or service, for example? The second one is, how can we help people understand AI? And that's teachers, that's learners, that's actually everybody, because we need everybody to have AI literacy. They don't all need to understand how to build AI. They don't need the technical understanding, but they do need an understanding, and particularly teachers and learners. So that's the second lens. And then the third lens, which is the hardest one, is how are we going to change our education systems? Because we now have AI that can do lots of the things that we've been teaching our students to do. But this here isn't a finished piece of work. Our intelligence is still evolving. So this is a moment in time when we have to say, actually, we've now got to change. We've now got to develop our education and assessment systems so that we start to be able to develop and assess our sophisticated human intelligence that's different from the AI, the really sophisticated, thinking skills that only the human brain can do at the moment. Now, what's this got to do with what I'm saying about EdTechs? Well, as part of that last piece, but related to the other two lenses, the lens of using the EdTech and the lens of helping people be able to use AI, all of which are connected, comes back to that golden triangle and comes back to data and evidence. And I think at the moment we often miss the way that AI adds an extra tool. If I just flick back to this when we were talking about, and I was saying how difficult it is to get that causal evidence. Oh, that's not what's showing on my screen. Oh, sorry about this, people. How interesting. It's gone. There we go. How difficult it is to get causal evidence. If we think about that golden triangle, and if we think about data, and we think about you've got your logic model, and you've worked out where, at each step of the way, you are going to collect data, AI can be a hugely powerful tool in the way you analyze that data. So rather than thinking about AI as as something that's part of an EdTech product or service that helps generate content, for example, generate lesson plans, if we think about AI as a tool in the researcher's toolkit, a tool that we can use to demonstrate the impact of our technology, as part of this research methodology, the way that we can use AI methods to analyze data in a way that traditional research is not able to do, then we really start to leverage the extent to which we can demonstrate the impact of our educational technology, but also how we can start to speak to the need to demonstrate the way that we are helping to improve learning and performance with respect to these higher order thinking capacities that we need to develop in individuals. So I want to end on the note that is very positive about the way that AI is an extra tool in the toolbox of any EdTech when they're trying to demonstrate the efficacy of their product or service. And so we have now, Educate Ventures, developed AI training for businesses to sit alongside this impact training so that as we're helping them to understand how to build that logic model, we're also helping them to understand what AI can do for their business, where it fits in their business, how they build a roadmap of the way in which AI is going to empower their business. And a really important part of empowering that business is in using AI to empower the way that they analyze the data they collect about the way their product or service is or is not improving learning and performance outcomes.